The 1967 devaluation of the pound sterling. Jacques R. Artis. I. Introduction. W. O. Reason. T. Investigation. S. of Th. E. 196. 7. Devaluatio. N. O. F. Th. E. Pound. D. Sterling. G. Conclude. D. That the benefit. S. O. F. De. T. Devaluatio. N. W. E. Delay. D. In timing and were relatively small in magnitude. If confirmed, their conclusion would clearly tend to undermine the case for exchange rate changes as a means of promoting current account adjustment. It would also refute the previous consensus on the size of international trade elasticities. It is therefore of the greatest importance to scrutinize the devaluation experience of the United Kingdom more closely, so that the right lessons may be drawn from it. A further and more detailed investigation of the UK devaluation is presented here. Its conclusion differs sharply from that reached in the recent investigations by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research (NIESR, 1972) and the London Business School (LBS) by Ball, Burns, and Miller, 1972. It is estimated in the present study that positive benefits from the devaluation occurred relatively rapidly and were large in their magnitude. One reason for the different results obtained in the present study lies in the methodological approach used. The study by the NIESR sought to estimate what the UK current balance would have been in the absence of devaluation, based on the extrapolation of trade equations estimated from data on the pre-devaluation period and guesstimates of what the movement of relative prices would have been in the absence of devaluation. The residual between the forecast thus generated and the actual outearn for the balance of payments was then defined as the devaluation effect. The shortcoming of this method is that the residual between forecast and outearn may be due not only to the effects of devaluation but also. Mr. Artis, Assistant Chief of the Special Studies Division of the Research Department, holds degrees from the Faculty of Law and Economics in Paris and from the University of California at Berkeley. To other changes in structural relationships, or to purely random factors, which assumed particular importance in the post-devaluation period. The method of calculation in the LBS study is based on simulation of an econometric model much larger than the one used in the present study, but the LBS model was not designed specifically for calculating the effect of a devaluation and is not quite appropriate for that purpose. Point 1. Both the NIESR and LBS methods were found to underestimate significantly the devaluation effect, in particular, its effect on UK imports. The methodology followed in the present paper is to focus the analysis on the critical economic relationships that determine the effect of a devaluation, and to estimate them whenever appropriate over a period which spans the devaluation 1960–72. The main relationships involved are 1. The devaluation effect on import prices, 2. The effect of import price changes via the cost of living on the wage price spiral, 3. The induced effect of wage and other cost changes on the price of UK traded goods, and 4. The response of domestic and foreign demand to changes of the relative price of UK and foreign goods. The last three relationships can be investigated for a period of years, since they are not generated only by exchange rate changes. Given the values of the coefficients, the entire model can be simulated so as to obtain an estimate of the effect of a change in the exchange rate. Two conventions are used in the present paper. First, for expositional convenience, the UK devaluation refers not only to the 14.3% devaluation of sterling in terms of foreign exchange, announced on November 18, 1967, but to the complete set of exchange rate changes that took place in November 1967.2. The incomes policy introduced in March 1968 is also considered to be an integral part of the 1967 devaluation measure, whereas the coincidental changes in the indirect taxes and in subsidies are considered separately. Point 3. Second, for analytical reasons, variations in the overall level of production in the UK economy are not ascribed to the devaluation. In other words, devaluation effects are estimated holding constant the overall level of economic activity. These estimated devaluation effects can be described as effects on the full employ. 1. In particular, the degree of aggregation of the trade equations and the faulty specification of the relative price terms make the LBS model unsuitable for the estimation of price elasticities of demand for U.K. imports and exports. See the appendix, introductory remarks. 2. About 20 countries, including most of those in the sterling area, devalued along with the pound. However, none of the large industrial countries devalued at the same time or shortly after. 3. The distinction between what is an integral part of the devaluation measure and what is not is somewhat arbitrary. The study focuses here on what is possibly the most interesting policy package: devaluation with incomes policy. Meant current balance. This assumption may be justified on the grounds that government authorities generally manage aggregate demand so as to maintain gross domestic product (GDP) at a certain target level, a target level that does not depend on the exchange rate and is likely to reflect mainly a target employment rate. By use of this assumption, the analysis is focused on the devaluation effect on relative prices and on the specific goal of the devaluation, the improvement in the balance of payments, holding constant the overall level of production. However, this is not to say that an interpretation of balance of payments developments after 1967 does not need to take into account the demand management policy actually followed by UK authorities during that period, policy that might have reinforced the devaluation effect or might have offset it. In the final section of the paper, this demand management policy is considered in some detail in an attempt to relate current balance developments after 1967 to the estimate of the devaluation effect as defined here. In Section 2, devaluation effects on UK prices are traced through input-output tables, the wage price spiral, and ultimately UK export prices and prices of UK products competing with imports. Price elasticities of demand for UK imports and exports are examined in Section 3. Particular emphasis is given to the estimation of demand price elasticities for UK imports and exports of manufactures. The estimated price elasticities of demand and the calculated relative price changes are then employed in Section IV to obtain an estimate of the effects of the 1967 devaluation on the full employment current balance. The question of whether or not the management of aggregate demand over the 1967-71 period was adequate to allow devaluation to have its intended effects is considered in Section V. The partial equilibrium econometric model used to derive most of the results of this study appears in the appendix. 2. Devaluation effects on the relative price of UK products. The fundamental impact effect of a devaluation is to reduce the foreign exchange price of the devaluing country's goods relative to foreign goods. However, this impact effect triggers an adjustment process that is by no means simple. The increase in prices of imported products employed as inputs in production, the adjustment of prices of factors of production to price developments in the product markets, and the magnitude of the switch in demand at home and abroad in favor of the devaluing countries' goods and services will affect the whole structure of prices in the devaluing country. The foreign currency price of goods produced abroad may also be affected. While this adjustment process is too complex to be described fully, partial equilibrium analysis can focus attention on the main channels through which the devaluation effect has taken place. It also yields useful information on the quantitative magnitude of this effect, at least in the short run and medium run. The following partial equilibrium analysis deals sequentially with the effect of the devaluation on import prices, the inflationary effect of the wage price spiral, and finally, the adjustment of prices of UK products exported or competing with imports. Devaluation effect on import prices. Developments in the year following the devaluation indicate that UK import prices in sterling increased almost proportionately to the change in the exchange rate, taking into account simultaneous devaluations by other countries. Such a large pass-through is important because it makes imported goods less attractive to UK buyers. However, it also gives a strong push to the wage price spiral. Import price changes between the third quarter of 1967 and the third quarter of 1968 are analyzed below. By the third quarter of 1968, most imported products had been ordered at contract prices agreed on after the devaluation took place. 4. Percentage changes in import prices between the third quarter of 1967 and the third quarter of 1968 are presented in Table 1. As indicated in this table, once account is taken of changes in world market prices over the same period. 5. Most observed changes in import prices correspond quite closely to the average appreciation of foreign currencies of supplying countries in terms of sterling. Even if it is taken for granted that world market prices have themselves been lowered somewhat by the devaluation, these calculations indicate that foreign exporters of foodstuffs, raw materials, or even manufacturers did not absorb a large part of the change in the exchange rate in their profit margins. The estimate of the devaluation effect presented in Table 1 takes into account a notional adjustment for devaluation effects on world market prices. For foodstuffs, raw materials, and manufactures, the sterling price of imports rose by about 4. In the period immediately following a devaluation, the import price index, being based on delivery prices in sterling, is not significantly affected, unless contract prices agreed on before the devaluation were specified in foreign currencies. This short-run effect caused by delivery lags is considered further in Section 2. 5. The measurement of changes in world market prices is explained in Table 1. 1. This is the weighted average appreciation of foreign currencies of supplying countries. In terms of sterling, the weights are the shares of the supplying countries in 1967 in the UK import S of th, E commodit, Y considered. 2. For food, beverages, and D tobacco, and D for raw materials, data were obtained from the World Export Price Indices of the United Nations by commodity classes. The change in the price of fuels was obtained by averaging the import unit value indices for fuels. For major European countries, excluding the United Kingdom, changes in prices of semi-finished manufactures and finished manufactures were obtained by averaging the export unit value indices for these product groups for France, the Federal Republic of Germany, Japan, and United States. 3. Percentag. E chong. E. In. U. K. Import. T price. S in sterling deflated by world market prices. In foreign exchange, 90% of the import weighted average appreciation of currencies of supplying countries in terms of sterling. The case of crude petroleum is less clear because the same international companies are producing, shipping, and distributing it, so that the circa I.F. price at the UK port of entry is a somewhat arbitrary accounting price. The wage price spiral. The case for a devaluation rests to a large extent on the hypothesis that hourly labor earnings in money terms will be adjusted significantly less than by the full amount of the change in the exchange rate. This will place domestic entrepreneurs in a better position relative to their foreign competitors. The validity of this hypothesis rests crucially on the assumption that the wage price spiral triggered by the increase in import prices is dampened by the existence of sticky prices and incomes. In the following analysis, a model of the wage-price relationship is specified and econometric techniques are used to estimate the effect of the 1967 devaluation on hourly labor earnings and the cost of living. Results indicate that the UK experience is consistent with the hypothesis that labor earnings are not necessarily pushed to the full extent of the increase in the price of foreign exchange, at least in the short term or medium term. 3 to 4 years. The rise in hourly labor earnings caused by the devaluation was slow to appear and was significantly smaller than the increase in the price of foreign exchange. This was not so much the result of any money illusion on the part of employees as of the fact that the food, rent, and public services components of the cost of living index were not sharply increased by the devaluation. Furthermore, the incomes policy, adopted in March 1968, played a useful role in delaying the adjustment of labor earnings to the cost of living. In the most general terms, the wage price determination may be represented by the following three-equation model, where W equals proportionate rate of change of hourly labor earnings, pay equals expected proportionate rate of change of cost of living index, P equals proportionate rate of change of cost of living index, PF equals proportionate rate of change of food prices in home market, RH equals proportionate rate of change of non-food import prices in local currency. X9Y, Z equals vectors of additional predetermined variables, and RJI indicates the elasticity of variable with respect to variable J. The exchange rate, E, in units of local currency per unit of foreign exchange, influences both non-food import prices, M, and food prices. 6. Food as defined here includes alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and meals bought and consumed outside the home. P. Solving the system of equations for the elasticity of hourly labor earnings with respect to the exchange rate yields. 7. Where partial elasticities for simultaneous and lagged values of right-hand side variables by half-year periods are shown in parentheses. Results indicate that hourly labor earnings in manufacturing do adjust rapidly to increases in retail prices. However, the sum of elasticities of retail prices with respect to hourly labor costs, non-food import prices, and food prices is less than unity 77 carat plus T carat trademark plus IFRJ equals 0.89. One reason for this result is that components of the retail price index, such as rent and charges for public services, do not adjust rapidly to changes in hourly. And condition 5 implies that labor neither is the victim of money illusion nor is unable to obtain cost of living adjustments and that price increases are fully anticipated eventually. Condition 6 is met if 1. Prices of non-food imports in local currency change proportionately to the change in the exchange rate, that is, T. Trademark equals 1, and 2. Gross profit margins on non-food products and retail prices are proportionate to production costs. In terms of labor and imported inputs, that is, T. Phi A equals 1. 8. Available data on labor earnings for other components of the labor force. Index of average earnings of all employees indicate that the rate at which they are adjusted to variations in retail prices is not markedly different from the one for hourly earnings of manual workers in manufacturing. Thus, this latter variable can be used in the present analysis as a proxy for the average rate of hourly labor earnings. In th. E whole econom. Y. Excluding. G. Earning. S of self-employee. D. Persons. 9. T. S. Parameter. R. Change. S. Over time. Semicolon. The estimate. E of 0.43 refer. S. To 1. Earnings. Another reason might be that gross profit margins, in proportionate terms, in the non-food sector are reduced whenever production costs rise rapidly. The major dampening factor on the wage price spiral was found to be the relatively small effect of the devaluation on food prices. Such effects are difficult to identify precisely because of the large tax element in the retail price of alcoholic beverages and tobacco, direct governmental controls on certain food products, subsidies to farmers, and various import controls, and particularly, variations in agricultural prices caused by crop variance. Nevertheless, a rough estimate of exchange rate effects can be obtained by decomposing changes in food prices before and after the devaluation into variations attributable to changes in world food prices, devaluation effects on import prices, import levies, indirect taxes, and other factors. See Table 2.10. The category Other Factors covers variations in the gross income of farmers, food processors, and distributors per unit of output. This item, which accounted for increases of 2.5 percentage points in food prices per year on average over the period 1962-67, played a less important role in the year and a half after the devaluation. This suggests that gross incomes of farmers, food processors, and distributors may have acted as a buffer, absorbing some of the initial effects of the rise in import prices. 11. Furthermore, even including some catch-up effects in 1969-71, exchange rate effects on food prices do not seem to have exceeded the 4.4 percentage points, directly attributable to effects taking place through import prices. 12. Given that the average appreciation of the currencies of countries exporting food to the United Kingdom was only 10.4% in terms of sterling, that is, E equals 10.4, a value of 0.40, 0.10, 0.10, 0.05, 0.05, 0.05, and 0.05. 10. The decomposition is based on the 1968 input-output tables, with direct and indirect import contents amounting to about 40% of the retail value of food products. Effects of a variation in import prices on the domestic price of food were assumed to take place with a 3-month lag. 11. Farmers seem to have been among the main victims of the devaluation. Prices paid to farmers increased by only 3.6% between the 1966-67 July-June harvest and the 1968-69 harvest, while their costs increased by about 11% over the same period. In particular, labor costs per hour of hired men increased by 13.6% over that period. Even later on, for the 1969-70 and 1970-71 harvests, prices paid to farmers increased less rapidly than either costs or consumer prices. 12. Rough estimates of exchange rate effects on food prices per period at an annual rate can be obtained by summing price increases attributable to devaluation, effects on import prices, Table 2, and the deviations of price increases caused by other factors, Table 2, from the trend rate of 2.5. By the end of 1971, cumulative exchange rate effects amounted to 4.3 percentage points. However, such a deviation from trend method, while suggestive, is far from being rigorous. In particular, price increases caused by other factors from the second quarter of 1969 onward either could reflect catch-up effects to reconstitute profit margins or could be a new normal level resulting from a higher rate of inflation. Seems a fair estimate, possibly on the high side, for the elasticity of food prices with respect to the exchange rate (REF-E) as far as the 1967 devaluation is concerned. Based on the preceding results and on the elasticity of non-food import prices with respect to the exchange rate calculated in Section 2. RJM E equals 0.9, Equation 4 yields an estimate of 0.42 for the elasticity of hourly labor earnings in manufacturing with respect to the exchange rate RJ(E). Thus, labor earnings in money terms would not normally be adjusted by anything like the full amount of the devaluation. In the case of the 1967 devaluation, the initial impact on wages and prices was limited because of the relatively low increase in the import price of foodstuffs resulting from concomitant devaluations by supplying countries. And the wage price spiral was dampened by certain measures to restrain hourly labor earnings during 1968-69.13. Estimates presented in the appendix indicate that measures to restrain hourly labor earnings cut their rate of increase by 1.2 percentage points in each half-year period in 1968 and 1969. However, abolition of these measures at the end of 1969 resulted in a catch-up effect that added 3.9 percentage points to the rate of increase of hourly labor earnings in the first half of 1970 and 1.9 percentage points in the second half of 1970.14. The net effect of these measures was somewhat perverse, a 1 percentage point increase in hourly earnings. However, they did slow down sharply the speed at which hourly earnings were adjusted to devaluation-induced increases in consumer prices. A simulation of the effects of the 1967 devaluation and wage restraint measures is presented in Table 3. The results indicate that it was not until 1970, when the period of wage restraint ended, that the devaluation effect on hourly labor earnings was allowed to take place. By the end of the adjustment period, hourly earnings and consumer prices had been raised by 6.8 and 5.6%, respectively, as a result of the devaluation and of measures to restrain hourly earnings. As explained in the appendix, such results must be regarded as quite tentative. Economic theory and econometric methods have been notoriously unsuccessful in explaining changes in the money wage rate, particularly in the United Kingdom. The better fit. 13. A description of the incomes policy operated from March 1968 can be found in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Economic Surveys, United Kingdom, 1968 pp. 39-41. 14. Various explanations have been given for the high rate of increase of hourly labor earnings in 1970, see Johnson and Nobe, 1971. The hypothesis accepted here is that it was a delayed response to the devaluation. To the extent that other factors may have played a role, the present estimate of the devaluation effect on labor earnings and retail prices may be on the high side. 1. The model presented in the appendix was employed to simulate economic developments after 1967 under alternative assumptions as to the exchange rate. Results indicated here refer to the difference between values of the variables in the simulation assuming away the November 1967 changes in exchange rates with accompanying measures of wage restraint, that is, the control solution, and those in the simulations assuming the actual exchange rate changes that took place in November 1967 with accompanying measures of wage restraint. Differences are expressed in percentages of values taken by the variables in the control solution of more recent wage equations, including the one employed here, results from a search process for an equation that fits the data rather than from a better understanding of the wage determination process. Further, the stability of any wage equations can be questioned on both a priori and empirical grounds. 15. Nevertheless, the main conclusion of the present study cannot be doubted. Chart 1 makes it quite obvious that increases in hourly earnings in manufacturing, adjusted for overtime, were abnormally low in 1968-69. Given the relatively large increases in retail prices and the moderately tight labor market. 16. For 2 years, the rate of increase in hourly earnings, adjusted for overtime and in real terms, was kept below the rate of increase in the standard output per man-hour, about 5% a year at the end of the 1960s. However, real earnings more than caught up in 1970. 15. Recent econometric studies on the U.K. wage equation include Goldstein and Kahn 1974, Spitaler 1974, and Taylor 1974. See also studies published in Johnson and Nobe 1971 and Parkin and Summers 1972. It is comforting that on the whole these studies have reached similar results, particularly as regards the rapid adjustment of the money wage rate to increases in the cost of living in the late 1960s and early 1970s. 16. The large increase in registered unemployment in that period is misleading. Improvements in unemployment benefits are likely to have encouraged workers to stay on the books. Moreover, labor hoarding within firms decreased sharply during that period, probably because of the selective employment tax. Lower rates of increase in the labor force because of demographic trends increased labor shortages, as indicated by the number of vacancies. On these points see Braun, 1971. And Taylor, 1974. The series on the unused labor force depicted in Chart 1 were obtained from Taylor. Effect on domestic and export prices of U.K. products. Given a set of demand elasticities, an accommodating aggregate demand policy, and a certain change in prices of foreign goods in foreign exchange, the extent of the switch in demand away from foreign toward U.K. traded goods is uniquely determined by variations in prices of U.K. products. Difficulty arises, however, in tracing the exchange rate effect on prices of U.K. products. The following analysis considers mainly the effect on prices of U.K. manufacturers competing with imported products, and on export prices of U.K. manufacturers. These are the crucial prices. Because U.K. Exports of non-manufactures are not large, less than 15% of total exports in 1967, and elasticities of demand for UK. Imports and exports of manufactures are far higher than elasticities of demand for UK. Imports of non-manufactures. A study of the pricing behavior of entrepreneurs in the manufacturing sector is presented in Artis 1974, only a brief summary of the approach employed in that study is presented here, with a more detailed explanation. In the appendix, desired long-run supply prices of UK manufactures in export markets P** are competing with imports P** are specified as a function of the standard level of hourly labor cost W 17 prices of intermediate inputs P* and the standard output per man-hour YLX or YFY, with all prices expressed in sterling. However, in the short run, factors such as product prices in the preceding period, PX1 and PH1, the level of unused capacity in the UK manufacturing sector, CU, and changes in sterling prices of competing products KPCX for products competing with UK exports, and APCH for UK products competing with imported goods temporarily influence the pricing behavior of entrepreneurs. Price equations explaining actual prices PX and PH also include the exchange rate E and are specified as and 17 hourly labor earnings of manual workers men 21 years and over, in manufacturing, adjusted for overtime work and labor costs other than labor earnings. In the appendix, price equations derived from the model above are estimated for semi-finished manufactures and finished manufactures. Separately, from observations on the period 1960-72. The exchange rate effect on PX and PH can take place directly or indirectly through the effect of the exchange rate on 1. Sterling prices of competing products. AP and APCH. 2. Standard rate of hourly labor cost. W. 3. Prices of intermediate inputs. PIF. 4. Standard output per man-hour. Y. LX or Y. And 5. Capacity utilization. CW.LS. The effect on the sterling price of competing products is assumed to be somewhat less than proportionate to the change in the exchange rate. The foreign exchange price of competing products was assumed to be cut so as to compensate for about 10% of the change in the exchange rate. The exchange rate effect on hourly labor earnings was estimated above 0.19. The effect on prices of intermediate inputs was estimated by taking into account the change in the price of imported products and in the price of intermediate products supplied by UK industries. Effects on output per man-hour and capacity utilization are not taken into account in the partial equilibrium analysis presented here. 20. The effect of the 1967 devaluation and accompanying measures of wage restraint on prices of UK manufactures was estimated by employing the model presented in the appendix under the set of hypotheses listed above. The results are given in Table 4. Feedbacks of the 1967 devaluation on export prices of UK manufactures were large. By 1971, they accounted for an increase in export prices of UK semi-finished and finished manufactures of 6.5 and 9 percentage points, respectively. 0.21. The effect on export prices of semi-finished manufactures took place quite rapidly, while the effect on export prices of finished manufactures stayed below or at about 6 percentage points up to the second half of 1970, when hourly labor earnings started to rise sharply and were passed through in 18. The fact that the overall level of output in the economy is assumed to be maintained does not preclude an expansion of the manufacturing sector at the expense of other sectors, expansion that could lead to a change in the output per manho. R. N. Capacit. Y. Utilizatio. N. In the manufacturing G. sector. 19. Labo. R. Costs. Off. R. Than. Earning. S. Or assume. D. Not to be affected by exchange rate effects. 20. Price implications of any changes in capacity utilization would be small. In the model presented in the appendix, the level of capacity utilization is found to have only minor effects on trade prices. The exchange rate effect on standard output per Man-hour in sectors producing for exports or competing with imports cannot be reliably identified. Nevertheless, this effect could be important in the long run. 21. Estimates of final price effects presented in Table 4 have only an analytical value. They are based on the assumption of unchanged output per man-hour in industries producing for exports or competing with imports, an assumption that is not valid in the long run. Furthermore, long-run implications of dynamic econometric models are far from reliable prices. The effect on export prices of foodstuffs amounted to 2 percentage points up to 1970 and then increased gradually by half a percentage point each half year to reach 4 percentage points in the second half of 1971. The effect on export prices of raw materials and fuels amounted to 9 percentage points over the entire period. The effect on prices of foreign travel services was assumed to be identical to the effect on consumer prices, see Table 4. For other private services, the devaluation effect was estimated to raise sterling prices by 10 percentage points over the period. Except in the case of manufactures, prices of products competing with imports played an important role only as far as foreign travel and foodstuffs are concerned. Prices of UK travel services can be assumed to be the same whether exported bought by foreign travelers or purchased by UK residents who spend their vacation in the United Kingdom rather than abroad. Prices of UK food products competing with imports were assumed to behave as UK export prices for foodstuffs. The devaluation effect on import prices of goods has already been discussed. The devaluation effect on import prices of private services was calculated by making a rough estimate of the share of these services having a price denominated in foreign exchange. 3. Price elasticities of demand for UK imports and exports. A devaluation has a twofold effect on demand in the devaluing country. First, it switches demand away from foreign traded goods and services toward domestic traded goods and services, and second, it switches demand away from traded goods and services toward non-traded goods and services. The effect on demand in the rest of the world works in the opposite direction. The intensity of the switching effect in the devaluing country and in the rest of the world depends on the size of the effective changes in relative prices induced by the devaluation and on the magnitude of the price elasticities of demand for the goods and services. Price elasticities of demand are considered in the present section. Such elasticities play a crucial role in the adjustment process. High price elasticities of demand make it more likely that a devaluation will succeed because the large initial switch in demand that follows the devaluation will start the adjustment process on the right path, and ultimately, smaller effective changes in relative prices and in the terms of trade will be needed to obtain a given transfer of resources to the external sector. The price elasticities of demand that play the crucial role in a devaluation are those for imports and exports of goods and services. They reflect the influence of relative prices on the choice between the devaluing country's goods and services and similar goods and services of foreign origin. 22. Other price elasticities to be considered are those between different types of consumer goods, say, foodstuffs and housing. The various elasticities are difficult to estimate, and the diversity of econometric results obtained from often careless studies of UK foreign and domestic trade flows has greatly contributed to the controversy on the magnitude of the effects of a devaluation of the pound sterling, a controversy that started before the 1967 devaluation and was stimulated rather than settled by post-devaluation developments. The dominant view before the devaluation was that the price elasticity of demand for UK imports of goods was between 0.5 and -1.0, and that for UK exports of goods it was about 0.23. No firm views were held as to the price elasticities for services. The sharp rise in the volume of UK imports of nearly all kinds of products in 1968-69 and the poor UK export performance in 1968 led many observers to reject previous optimistic views on price elasticities and to conclude rather that these elasticities were nil or quite small. It is argued here that the empirical evidence does not warrant such a conclusion. In contrast, it tends to support the predevaluation assumptions. In this section, the following price elasticities of demand are considered sequentially. 1. Elasticities for UK imports of goods. 2. Cross-price elasticities between various kinds of consumer goods and services in the UK market. 24. 3. Elasticities for UK exports of goods, and 4. Elasticities for UK imports and exports of services. 22. Import and export price elasticities are sometimes defined as reflecting the influence of import and export prices on the demand for imports and exports, assuming all other prices to be constant. However, it is difficult to estimate such parameters, and their usefulness is dubious. It seems preferable to define those elasticities in terms of the influence of import and export prices relative to similar domestic and foreign products, assuming that the demand for the various types of products is constant. For example, the price elasticity of imports of foodstuffs in the UK market reflects the effect of the relative price of UK and foreign foodstuffs on the demand for foreign foodstuffs in the UK market, given the total UK demand for foodstuffs. The effect of a change in the ratio between the average price for foodstuffs, including domestic and foreign products, and, say, the average price for housing, is then considered separately. The theoretical base of this approach is presented in Armington, 1969. 23. C. Cohen, 1971, page 221, and Cooper, 1968, pp. 188-89. 24. Price elasticities between various types of investment goods are likely to be negligible. Price elasticities between various types of consumer goods abroad do not play an important role here because UK exports do not account for such a large weight of the supply available to the rest of the world that they may affect relative prices of consumer goods abroad. Difficulties in estimating price elasticities of demand in international trade arise mainly because the appropriate price term in an aggregate trade equation is complex and difficult to construct. 25. The use of a simple ratio between the total import-export price index and the wholesale price index for domestic, foreign goods would introduce a substantial bias into the estimates. In particular for UK imports, historical variations in aggregate price series are dominated by movements in commodity prices for which the price elasticities of demand are likely to be quite small. Any estimated aggregate price elasticity based on such data is likely to be biased downward and has no relevance to the study of effects of relative price changes caused by the devaluation. In the econometric model presented in the appendix, price elasticities for semi-finished manufactures and finished manufactures were estimated from observations on the 1960-72 period. In this study, aggregate price series for UK goods competing with imports were reweighted by the shares of the various products in UK imports to the extent that data made this reweighting possible. The estimated long-run price elasticities are -3.4, 0.7, 26 for semi-finished manufactures and -1.0, 0.3, 4 finished manufactures. These relatively high price elasticities reflect the attempt made in the present study to compare import prices to prices of comparable domestic products. When this is done, relative price changes, in particular, for metals, textile fibers, and basic chemicals, are found to be quite small with proportionately large effects on demand, as could be expected on a priori grounds for relatively homogeneous products. No significant differences were found between price elasticities in the predevaluation period 1960-67 and the post-devaluation period 1968-72.27. As regards timing, all of the relative price effects took 25. See Lerner and Stern, 1970, pp. 41-48 for a theoretical presentation of the problem of aggregation, and see Barker, 1970, pp. 58-59 for an empirical study of the aggregate E. Bia S in the SAW E of U. Dot K. Impor. T. Prick. E. Elasticities. Dot. 2. 6. Number. S. In parentheses. S. Reef. R. 2. Th. E. Standar. D. Error. S. Of the point. T. Estimates. 27. The methodology of calculating the relevant elasticities over a long period and then applying them to a given percentage devaluation implicitly assumes that the elasticities are unaffected by either the size or the nature of the external shock. In the present case, an attempt was made to detect a change in the price elasticities between the pre-devaluation and the post-devaluation periods. The test was made for finished and semi-finished manufactures, separately, as follows. The relevant relative price variable was split into two separate variables. One covered the period before 1968 and remained constant thereafter, and the other assumed the value of unity before 1968 and was equal to the ratio of the price variable to its value in the second half of 1967 thereafter. A Chow test was made on the two sets of estimated price elasticities, but results for either finished or semi-finished manufactures did not indicate structural changes at the 10% significance level. However, the Chow test is somewhat biased against detecting structural changes in the present case. Because Allman lags or EMP place within a year for finished manufactures and within 2 years for semi-finished manufactures, it is likely that further effects did occur later, although they are too spread out over time to be identifiable. All available empirical studies have concluded that price elasticities of demand for U.K. imports of foodstuffs, raw materials, and fuels are relatively low. For a large number of these products, imports provide the only source of supply, at least over the medium term and for the range of price variations considered here. However, there are also various imported products, such as alcoholic beverages, beef, temperate vegetables and fruits, and cheese, that do compete directly with domestic products, so that the demand for these categories should not be considered as completely price inelastic. The estimates obtained by Barker, 1970, for the Cambridge Growth Project that are presented in Table 5 will be taken here as indicative of the magnitude of the price elasticities for these categories, although somewhat dated, since Barker's study covers only the 1949-66 period. These estimates remain the most comprehensive available. The import price elasticities considered here do not represent all the effects of changes in import prices on the distribution of aggregate demand. Changes in the average prices of different kinds of products may cause a switch in total demand away from certain types of products toward others, say, away from foodstuffs toward houses. The modern theory of exchange rate effects has put much emphasis on the substitution away from traded goods toward non-traded goods in final demand. C. Pierce, 1961. In a largely open economy, the foreign exchange prices of traded goods, whether domestic or imported, should be influenced mainly by world market forces, with exchange rates having little effect on them. Exchange rate variations would only affect the price of non-traded goods relative to prices of traded goods. Price elasticities between different types of products are difficult to estimate directly without constraints, and methods have been designed to solve the difficulty by making use of a priori considerations in the estimation procedure. The Frisch method was employed here to derive the matrix of price elasticities between foodstuffs, fuels, finished manufactures, and non-traded goods and services for final consumption. 28. The results are presented in Table 6. These price elasticity Table 6. Income compensated price elasticities of demand between various kinds of consumer goods in the U.K. market. Elasticities of demand for goods listed at left with respect to prices of goods listed below. Commodity, food, beverages, and tobacco. Fuels, finished manufactures, non-traded goods. Share in consumption. In 1967, 0.17, 0.05, 0.17, 0.60, food, beverages, and tobacco, minus 0.19, 0.04, 0.07, 0.03, Fuels. 0.01, minus 0.488. 0.05, 0.02. Finished. Manufactures. 0.07, 0.18, minus 0.688. 0.16. Non-traded. Goods. 0.11, 0.26, 0.55, minus 0.211. 28. See Frisch 1959. Angle elasticities A. Employed here, foodstuffs, 0.4, manufactures, 2.1, non-traded goods and services, 0.9, and fuels, 1.0, or based on Gomeletso's 1973, for the first three estimates and Kennedy, 1974, for the last one. The money flexibility, less than pound, is given a value of minus 2.0, the median value suggested by Frisch. Income compensated price elasticities of demand for good I with respect to the price of good J nij and the price of good I na are defined as where C is the share of good I in consumption in 1967. Ties are quite small by comparison with those between domestic and imported products of the same kind. As indicated in Section 2, changes in relative prices of various kinds of consumer goods induced by the devaluation were also small, so that the quantitative importance of this aspect of exchange rate effects seems limited, at least in the case of the 1967 UK devaluation. These effects are ignored in the rest of the present paper. Price elasticities of demand for UK exports are also difficult to estimate, partly because numerous strikes of industrial workers, dock workers, and seamen distort trade figures even more than they are distorted on the imports side. Price elasticities of demand for UK exports of semi-finished manufactures and finished manufactures were estimated from observations on the period 1960-72 as part of the econometric model presented in the appendix. These estimates, presented in Table 7, are based. Table 7. Price elasticities of demand for UK exports of goods. Commodity. 1. Food, beverages, and tobacco. 0. 1. Raw materials. 2. 4. Fuels. 3. Semi-finished manufactures. 5. 6. 3. Finished manufactures. 7. 8. Share. In UK exports in 19,677. 0.07. 0.03. 0.03, 0.35, 0.50. Price elasticities. Cambridge. Growth. Project. 2. Minus 1.22. Minus 0.66. Minus 1.77. Minus 1.0. Minus 1.5. Of demand. Present. Study. Minus 2.55. Minus 1.44. 1. The commodity classification is based on the revised Standard International Trade Classificatio. NSITC. Th. ESITC category. S or indicate. D. I. N parentheses. 2. These estimate. SW or E obtain. D by the author. R from Th. E. More. E detailed result. S covering 16 groups of products presented by L. A. Winters, Regressions for UK Export. Volumes, mimeographed, 1974. The aggregation was made by using 1967 trade weights. 3. Exclude. S. Precious stones, 667. 4. See Table 5, footnote 4. On aggregate price series for foreign products competing with UK exports obtained by weighting disaggregated foreign price series by the shares of the exporting countries in the world market and by the shares of the products in UK exports. The estimated long-run price elasticities are minus 2.5, 0.6 for semi-finished manufactures and minus 1.4, 0.1 for finish manufactures. Price elasticities of demand for UK exports of food, raw materials, and fuels were obtained from the study prepared by Winters. 1974 for the Cambridge Growth Project. 29. These elasticities are reported in Table 7. Price elasticities of demand for UK imports and exports of private Services are even more difficult to estimate because of a lack of reliable data on relevant prices. Empirical studies have dealt mainly with foreign travel and transportation services, with all other private services aggregated together in a residual category, for example, see Phillips, 1974. The demands for foreign travel services by U.K. residents and for U.K. travel services by foreigners have been shown to be quite price elastic. Estimates employed in the present study, 2.20 for U.K. imports and -1.66 for U.K. exports. 30 were obtained from Artis 1972.31. The demand for transportation services is to a large extent a complementary demand and is influenced by relative prices of U.K. goods and foreign travel services. International airfares and freight rates are to a large extent fixed by international conferences, so that the demand for transportation services supplied by ships or platies under a given flag is not influenced by relative prices among competing countries. However, the U.K. demand for foreign transportation services is influenced by the volume of imports of goods and foreign travel services. Phillips 1974 estimate of 0.5 for the elasticity of U.K. imports of shipping services with respect to imports of goods and for the elasticity of U.K. imports of civil aviation services with respect to imports of foreign travel services is used here. Similarly, U.K. exports of civil aviation services are influenced by U.K. exports of foreign travel services. The elasticity of 0.3 estimated by Phillips is also used here. 0.32. U.K. exports of shipping services correspond mainly to freight revenues from cross trades, charter receipts, and disbursements by overseas operators in the United Kingdom and will be assumed to be determined by factors not directly influenced by relative prices of U.K. goods and foreign travel services. Demand for U.K. imports and exports of other private services, financial services, Transac. 29. This working note presents preliminary results subject to revisions. The estimate SW derived fro M observation SO.N. The Purio D 1955-71. 30. These estimate S ref R to the 4 N exchange rat component T of relative prices. Artis 1972 pp. 596 and 603. The estimate for U.K. imports employed here is the Arithmetica L of Varig, E of Th, E2 estimate, S indicate, D, O, N PAG, E, 596, 3, 1. More recently, Philip, S. 1974. Obtain, D and Eve, N, large, R, elasticit, Y of -6.04. Exports and no significant price elasticity for imports. However, his results are likely to be biased by the use of consumer prices as a proxy for prices of foreign travel service. S. Artis. 1972. 32. Phillips. Elasticity. S for shipping and civil aviation services are elasticities estimated at the mean, in a linear rather than log linear equation. Furthermore, they refer to variables in value terms rather than in volume terms, as seem called for by a priori considerations. However, to the extent that prices for dependent and independent variables are not systematically related, they may be interpreted as volume elasticities, although the estimates are likely to be somewhat biased and inefficient. Tie-ons between associated companies for services rendered, commissions on trade transactions, and so on, will also be considered to be price inelastic in volume terms. However, their sterling values will change as indicated in Section 2. Price elasticities considered here refer only to direct effects of relative price changes. Substitution in demand between two products will have secondary effects through the maze of input-output relationships. For example, a switch in demand in favor of U.K. finished manufactures at home or abroad may imply an increase in imports of the semi-finished manufactures or raw materials needed to produce those additional finished manufactures. However, the direct import content of U.K. K. Manufactures was only about 22% in 1968, so that these secondary effects cannot compensate for direct price effects to any large extent. See Section IV. Clearly, price elasticities of demand are parameters that cannot at present be estimated with precision, in view of the inadequate import and export price series available. Nevertheless, the empirical evidence obtained from disaggregated studies taking into account post-evaluation developments is all in favor of the price elasticity optimists. This evidence is also consistent with results of disaggregated studies for other countries. 33. The mysterious curse that is supposed to make everyone insensitive to relative prices whenever the choice is made between a U.K. product and another product is a myth that feeds on aggregation bias. IV. Devaluation effect on the full employment current balance. The price elasticities of demand and changes in relative prices calculated in the preceding sections determine the relative price effect of the devaluation on the full employment current balance. As explained above, this effect must be interpreted as caused by the devaluation, with the proviso that the exchange rate effect on total final demand is compensated for by an accommodating cut in domestic final demand so as to keep real GDP constant at its full employment level. While overall supply and demand remain constant, the exchange rate effect on demand and the effect of the policy-induced cut in domestic demand may not compensate for each other at the sector level. The exchange rate effect on the composition of demand and production will result in expenditure effects on 33. C. Krynen 1973, Kravis and Lipsey 1971, and Richardson 1972. Imports. Relative price and expenditure effects of the 1967 devaluation on the structure of production and the current balance are estimated below. These results are then compared with estimates obtained from simulations of the LBS and NIESR models. The relative price effect of the 1967 devaluation on U.K. trade flows in volume terms is presented in Table 8. Calculation of this effect from price elasticities of demand and relative price changes estimated above is straightforward. The cumulative effect on exports of goods increased gradually from a 2.9 percentage point rise in the first half of 1968 to a 12.7 percentage point rise in 1971. The final effect, after the wage price adjustment mechanism had worked itself out, amounted to only a 6.8 percentage point rise in the export volume of goods. Exports of foreign travel services were sharply increased by the devaluation, by 16 to 18 percentage points during the whole of the 1968-71 period and by nearly 13 percentage points at the end of the adjustment period. On the import side, the effect was smaller but still quite significant. Further, the import effect. Table 8. Cumulative relative price effects of the 1967 devaluation of sterling on the volume of U.K. foreign trade flows. L. In percent. 1,968. Items. Exports of goods and private services. Exports of goods. Foodstuffs S. Raw materials and fuels. Semi-finished manufactures 3. Finished manufactures. Exports of private services. Foreign travel. Other private services. Imports of goods and private services. Imports of goods. Foodstuffs FS. Raw materials and fuels. Semi-finished manufactures 3. Finished manufactures 4. Imports of private services. Foreign travel. Other private services. I. 2.8. 2.9. 4.5. 2.0. 4.3. 1.9. 2.6. 18.5. 0.6. Minus 2.88. Minus 2.44. Minus 1.00. Minus 0.11. Minus 9.88. Minus 4.44. Minus 17.44. Minus 2.33. 2. 4.6. 5.4. 9.0. 4.0. 6.2. 4.8. 2.5. 17.4. 0.6. Minus 385.5. Minus 3.401. Minus 1.55. Minus 1.66. Minus 13.1.1. minus 4.3.2, minus 15.4.1, minus 2.5.5, 1969, I, 6.6, 7.9, 13.6, 6.0, 7.6, 7.8, 2.5, 16.9, 0.6, minus 0.24.2, minus 4.22, minus 2.0.0, minus 3.8.5, minus 13.1.1, minus 4.4.4, minus 14.3.3, minus 2.7.74, I, 7.5, 9.5, 13.6, 6.0, 9.6, 10.1, 2.7, 17.4, 0.6, minus 4.8.8, minus 4.8.8, minus 2.5.5, minus 5.7.7, minus 13.5.5, minus 4.7.7, minus 15.4.4, minus 2.9.9, 1970, 9.1, 11.9, 13.3, 6.0, 14.0, 11.4, 2.7, 76.5, 0.6, minus 4.55, minus 4.6.6, minus 3.0.0, minus 5.7.7, minus 11.4.4, minus 4.3.3, minus 13.4.4, minus 2.7.7, 1971, 9.6, 12.7, 72.9, 6.0, 18.2, 10.2, 2.5, 16.1, 0.5, minus 4.00, minus 4.2.0, minus 3.0.0, minus 5.74, minus 8.77, minus 3.6.6, minus 9.5.5, minus 2.6.6. Final. Effects 2. 5.4, 6.8, 77.5, 6.0, 11.2, 3.4, 2.0, 12.8, 0.4, minus 3.55, minus 3.7.7, minus 3.0.0, minus 5.7.7, minus 6.4.4, minus 2.8.8, minus 6.8.8, minus 2.1.0. 1. See table. E3. Footnote. E1. Dot. 2. Total. SAR. E. Obtain. DB. Y. Weighten. G. The various items by their respective weights in 1971. 3. Excludes precious stones. 4. Excludes military aircraft. Occurred more rapidly. By the second half of 1968, imports of goods had been lowered by nearly 3.2 percentage points and imports of private services by about 4 percentage points. However, the effect on imports also started to decrease sooner, with a peak effect of 4.8 percentage points for goods and 4.7 percentage points for private services in the second half of 1969. The final effect still amounted to 3.7 percentage points for imports of goods and 2.8 percentage points for imports of private services. Most of the exchange rate effect on the import side is accounted for by the effect on imports of manufactures and foreign travel services. The effect of this switch in domestic and foreign demand in favor of UK traded goods is large, relative to UK productive capacities, and if CHE overall level of production is to be maintained, this switch in demand needs to be accompanied by a cut in real domestic demand. Real domestic final demand needs to be cut by an amount that increases gradually from 1.2 percentage points in the first half of 1968 to 2.9 percentage points by the 1970-71 period. The effect of this cut in domestic demand on various sectors of the UK economy, and ultimately on imports, obviously depends both on the nature of the economic measures chosen to obtain it and on expenditure elasticities of demand. Subsequent calculations Assume that current expenditures by consumers and public authorities and gross domestic capital formation are all cut by the same proportion. The cut in current expenditure by consumers and public authorities is allocated among the goods and services in relation to expenditure. Elasticities. 34. All goods and services going into gross domestic capital formation are cut by the same proportion. Estimated cuts in real domestic demand for goods are presented in Table 9. Combined effects of relative price changes and cuts in domestic demand on the structure of U.K. production are calculated by taking into account the input-output relationships by employing the 1968 input-output tables. These results are also presented in Table 9. Traded goods sectors, mainly sectors producing semi-finished manufactures, which have to expand not only because of the substitution of U.K. semi-finished products for foreign products but also to supply more products to other expanding U.K. manufacturing sectors, grow to the detriment of sectors producing other goods and services. By 1971, production of foodstuffs and finished manufactures increased by about 2 percentage points. The production of semi-finished manufactures was raised by nearly 6 percentage points, and the production of other goods and services was lowered by 34. The estimate for foreign travel services is obtained from Artis 1972. Estimates for other kinds of goods are based on results obtained by Gomeletzos 1973 and Kennedy 1974. See footnote 28. About 2 percentage points. These estimates are based on the assumption that, over the time span considered, factors of production are sufficiently mobile to allow the transfer of resources to take place without undue friction. This assumption does not seem unrealistic in a growing economy, where the adjustment can take place by allocating new resources to expanding sectors rather than by a transfer of resources as such. Nevertheless, as the U.K. economy is slow growing, the shifts described just above imply pressures on some types of capacity and labor or on labor in particular locations. Net expenditure effects of changes in the composition of aggregate demand and production on the volume of imports of goods and services are also calculated by employing the 1968 input-output tables. Results are presented in Table 9. Expenditure effects result in a relatively small cut in imports of goods and private services, less than 1 percentage point, with most of the decrease in imports of products for final domestic balance. It is difficult, if not impossible, to compare the actual balance of payments developments in the post-devaluation period with the estimate of the devaluation effect presented here, because many factors other than the 1967 devaluation have affected these developments. Nevertheless, the reconciliation between the estimated devaluation effect and actual current balance developments presented in Table 12 is useful as a rough check that the estimate of the devaluation effect is realistic. In Table 12, the factors behind the change in the current balance from its average level in 1965-67 have been decomposed into devaluation effects obtained from Table 10, effects of other policy measures, cyclical effects, and residuals. Effects of other policy measures take into account the abolition of the import surcharge, the increase in indirect taxes, the abolition of the export rebates, the reduction in the selective employment tax, the Kennedy round of tariff reductions, payments for U.S. military aircraft, and 35. It must be recognized that the NIESR did try to find a devaluation effect on the volume of U.K. imports of goods. It is only after finding a negative or perverse result for most products, except for semi-finished manufactures, that they adopted this assumption. It is likely that the major reason for its failure to identify a devaluation effect arose from the method of calculating devaluation effects by taking the residual between observed and predicted values. The predicted values calculated by using equations estimated from observations based on the period 1958 to the third quarter of 1967 failed to take into account properly factors such as the Kennedy round of tariff reductions implemented over the period 1968-71 that led to a more rapid expansion of U.K. foreign trade, imports and exports, in the late 1960s. and early 1970s. 36. The NIESR is mistaken when it explains that, this postulating that the dollar value of imports of goods remained unaffected by the devaluation, implies a small elasticity of the sign for imports of goods, since it is plausible to argue that import prices by 1970 had not risen by the full amount of a devaluation. 1972, p. 451. Viewed ex post, it can readily be seen that the underlying external position of the United Kingdom was such that only a devaluation could have achieved the right mixture of domestic stimulus and improvement in the payments situation. However, government authorities chose a policy of expansion based on an increase in domestic demand rather than on foreign demand. Devaluation. 39. The exchange rate of sterling was kept unchanged. Severe restraints on prices and wages were eliminated in July 1967. In June and again in August, expansionary fiscal measures were taken. Bank lending to public authorities and to the private sector was allowed to expand rapidly. See Table 13. Such a policy made a balance of payments crisis unavoidable. Closure of the Suez Canal, the Arab boycott after the Middle East conflict in June, and dock strikes in London and Liverpool in September and October accelerated the worsening trade situation, and ultimately the government devalued the pound under duress in November, with heavy losses to speculators. Consumer expenditure had already started to rise rapidly by the time the devaluation took place. The lack of measures to restrict domestic demand at the time of the devaluation and the announcement that such measures would come with the April 1968 budget led to a boom in consumer expenditure. 40. 38. The substantial surplus of the current balance in the fourth quarter of 1966 had been widely believed to mark a favorable trend. However, this was really a case of wishful thinking, since a large part of the surplus was due to importers delaying their purchases until the abolition of the import surcharge announced for November 1966. 39. The need for a policy of expansion is not questioned here, but the decision not to devalue is questioned. 40. An increase in the bank rate from 6.2 to 8%, restrictions on bank loans to the private sector, excluding exports, and a tightening of hire purchase terms for automobiles were implemented in November 1967. However, such measures could not have much impact, given the high liquidity of the private sector. See the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Economic Surveys. United Kingdom, 1969, pp. 35-48. Reductions to be made in public spending in the 1968 budget, April 1968 to March 1969, were announced in November 1967 and January 1968. B. Conclusion. The favorable effect of the 1967 devaluation of the pound sterling o. The U.K. current balance has been seriously underestimated by the LBS. And to an even greater extent by the NIESR, mainly because they assumed, on the basis of econometric work at a very aggregative level, that U.K. imports were not affected by relative price changes. Estimates of import price elasticities obtained in the present study and by others also working at a relatively disaggregated level do not support the contention that relative prices do not matter, and they cast a new light on the effect of the 1967 devaluation. Results obtained here indicate that the devaluation effect accounted for an improvement of about -1,300 million pounds, 3,100 million United States dollars in the U.K. current balance by 1971, 940 million pounds, 2,501 million United States dollars in the trade balance, and 331 million pounds, 614 million United States dollars in invisibles. Nearly 3% of GDP was transferred into the balance of payments as a result of the devaluation. Estimates refer to effects on the full employment current balance of the U.K. devaluation per se, accompanying measures of wage restraint, and concomitant devaluations by certain other countries. Effects of accompanying restrictive monetary and fiscal measures are included in those estimates to the extent that they were necessary to compensate for the direct devaluation effect on the total domestic and foreign demand for UK goods and services. Such estimates are subject to a relatively large margin of error. However, results do not leave much doubt that devaluation effects were favorable and large. Devaluation effects occurred relatively rapidly, but they were initially masked by the consequences of an expansionary domestic policy. Perverse effects on the trade balance did occur in the first half of 1968, but they were more than compensated for by favorable effects on private services and other invisibles. By the first half of 1969, favorable effects on the current balance were reaching nearly £600 million, 1,600 million United States dollars. At an annual rate, they reached more than £1,000 million, 2,600 United States dollars. Million in 1970. The volume of exports of semi-finished manufactures and finished manufactures expanded rapidly under the impetus of the devaluation. By 1971, the devaluation effect accounted for an 18% increase in the export volume of semi-finished manufactures and a 10% increase in the export volume of finished manufactures. The volume of imports of finished manufactures was also substantially reduced by the devaluation. By about low 1% by 1971, when both relative price and expenditure effects are considered. The other major effect of the devaluation was to improve the foreign travel balance. Other current account items played a less important role. The cost of the devaluation in terms of inflationary pressures and welfare losses was also high. By 1971, both consumer prices and hourly labor earnings were about 5 percentage points higher because of the devaluation. The devaluation worsened the terms of trade by about 4%. For goods, with export prices in sterling up by 7.8% and import prices up by 13%, and by 1% for private services. During the period 1968-71, the devaluation effect on the UK current balance was offset to some extent by other factors, such as a cut in export subsidies, higher indirect taxes, lower tariffs on the imports of manufactures, and so on. Nevertheless, the actual current balance was turned from a £316 million deficit in 1967 to a £1,093 million surplus in 1971.43. Wage restraints in 1968-69 and a restrictive fiscal and monetary policy. Dating from the second half of 1968, after a year and a half of expansionary demand management, were probably the major factors behind the success of the devaluation. Appendix. A partial equilibrium econometric model. Most of the key relationships that determine short-term and medium-term exchange rate effects in the United Kingdom have been investigated at length by econometricians, see, for example, Hilton and Heathfield, 1970. However, some dissatisfaction with methods employed in available studies and the need to have a complete, coherent model of key relationships estimated from observations covering a period that included the years following the 1967 devaluation of the pound sterling led to the specification and estimation of the model used in the present study. Introductory remarks. The model deals only with trade in manufactures and the wage price adjustment mechanism. Its coverage is further restricted in two respects. One, partial use is made of the small country assumption. Import prices in foreign exchange and the level of foreign demand are exogenous. Domestic prices of raw materials, fuels, and foodstuffs, in foreign exchange, are also exogenous. However, domestic and export prices of domestically produced manufactures are not constrained to be identical, and both sets of prices are endogenously determined in the model. 43. The deficit in 1967 was to some extent caused by strikes and other special factors. These special factors accounted possibly for half the deficit in 1967, see U.K. Treasury, Economic Report on 1967, No. 8 Her Majesty's Stationery Office. London. 1968. Empirical Result TSS. In general, the empirical results support those obtained in previous studies. However, on a number of points, important for the analysis of exchange rate effects, they differ significantly from earlier findings. Results of equations on trade flow and equations on wages and consumer prices are considered in sequence. Results for trade flow. Relative prices have large and statistically significant effects on the volume of U.K. exports and imports of manufactures. Most price effects take place within 2 to 3 years. These are the most noticeable results. In addition, there are 2 reasons to believe that estimates of the demand elasticities may be somewhat biased toward -1, that is, actual demand elasticities could be even higher than estimated values. First, while the aggregation procedure employed is a significant improvement over procedures used in most previous studies, it still remains rather crude because of a lack of highly disaggregated price series. Second, foreign trade unit values are highly unreliable. 0.49. Both factors tend to introduce large observation errors into the price and volume series. 0.50. Results on cyclical elasticities of U.K. exports with respect to foreign demand and U.K. imports with respect to domestic demand confirm results obtained in previous studies. U.K. exports of either finished manufactures or semi-finished manufactures respond only partially to a cyclical variation in foreign demand. To express it differently, the market share of the U.K. exporters contracts relatively faster in a period of rapid world trade expansion than in a period of slow growth. Cyclical elasticities of imports with respect to domestic demand are rather high, close to LL2 for both semi-finished and finished manufactures. Import elasticities with respect to trend rates of growth of relevant domestic demand aggregates are quite high, that is, over the 1960-72 period imports were growing much faster than domestic demand, and this is not explained by relative price variations alone. The estimated price equations indicate that U.K. entrepreneurs do not significantly adjust their prices for finished manufactures to variations in the prices set by their foreign competitors. Thus, even in the short run, prices of U.K. finished manufactures are mainly determined by cost. On the other hand, U.K. prices for semi-finished manufactures, either exported or competing with imports, are strongly influenced in the short run by variations in foreign prices for similar products. The short-run direct effect of a 10% increase in foreign prices is a 2.5% increase in U.K. export prices and an 8.8% increase in prices of U.K. products competing with imports in case of semi-finished manufactures. This result is not surprising, given the higher degree of homogeneity of most semi-finished manufactures. An attempt to include a capacity utilization variable in the price equations. 49. On the inadequacy of foreign trade unit values, see Kravis and Lipset 1971. 50. For a proof that these errors cause a bias in estimated price elasticities toward -1, see Kemp 1962. Had only limited success. It is only in the equation for the export price of semi-finished manufactures that a statistically significant effect was found. 2. Results for wages and consumer prices. The good statistical results for the wage equation should be viewed with reservation. The number of different equations that have been estimated in previous studies to explain the behavior of U.K. wages equations that the author could not ignore is so large that such an intensive digging work could not fail to yield a good equation in the sense that it fitted past data well. Subject to the above reservations, the empirical results strongly suggest that during the 1960s workers in the United Kingdom did not suffer from money illusion and were normally successful in protecting the real purchasing power of their earnings. Hourly earnings in the manufacturing sector corrected for overtime were adjusted fully, or even more than fully, to variations in consumer prices within a short period of time, a year or less in periods without legal wage restraints. During periods of wage restraints, including the 1968-69 post-devaluation period, the adjustment of money earnings to increases in the cost of living was temporarily held back. However, the wage explosion in 1970 after the removal of controls more than compensated for favorable effects of restraints during the previous 2 years. The percentage of labor force unused was found to have a relatively small but statistically Significant effect on variations in hourly earnings. 0.51. Variations in prices of foreign manufactures also seem to have some direct effect, probably because they influence the willingness of UK entrepreneurs to accept wage increases. However, this effect is not statistically significant. Not surprisingly, the equation for consumer prices indicates that import prices, foodstuffs excluded, and hourly earnings have certain effects on non-food consumer prices that broadly correspond to their input-output weights. Bibliography. Alexander, Sidney S., Effects of a Devaluation, A Simplified Synthesis of Elasticities and Absorption Approaches, American Economic Review, Volume 49. March 1959, pp. 22-42. Armington, Paul S., A Theory of Demand for Products Distinguished by Place of Production, Staff Papers, Volume 16, March 1969, pp. 159-78. Artis, Jacques R., An Econometric Analysis of International Travel, Staff Papers. Volume 19, November 1972, pp. 579-614. The Behavior of Export Prices for Manufactures, Staff Papers, Volume 21. November 1974, pp. 583-604. Ball, R. J. T. Burns, and G. Miller, Preliminary Simulations of the London Business School Model, Mimeographed, Graduate School of Business Studies. London, 1972. Barker, Terence S., Aggregation Error and Estimates of the U.K. Import Demand Function, asterisk in the Econometric Study of the United Kingdom, edited by Kenneth Hilton and David F. Heathfield, London, 1970, pp. 115-45. 51. The series on the percentage of labor force unused or obtained from Taylor. 1974. Braun, Ann R., Wages in the United Kingdom. Has there been a shift in the Phillips curve? Staff Papers, Volume 18, March 1971, pp. 136-82. Chaudhry, Nanda K., Yehuda Kodowitz, John A. Sawyer, and John W. L. Winder. The Trace Econometric Model of the Canadian Economy, University of Toronto Press, 1972. Cohen, C. D. British Economic Policy 1960-1969, London, 1971. Cooper, Richard N., The Balance of Payments, in Britain's Economic Prospects. Edited by Richard E. Caves and Associates. The Brookings Institution, Washington, 1968, pp. 147-97. Frisch, Ragnar, A Complete Scheme for Computing All Direct and Cross Demand Elasticities in a Model with Many Sectors, Econometrica, Volume 27. April 1959, pp. 177-96. Gomeletsos, Theodore, Further Analysis of Cross-Country Comparison of Consumer Expenditure Patterns, European Economic Review, Volume 4, April 1973, pp. 1-20. Goldstein, Morris, and Mosen S. Kahn, The Relative Stability of Selected Wage Inflation Models for the United Kingdom, unpublished, International Monetary Fund, December 1974. Hilton, Kenneth, and David F. Heathfield, editors, The Econometric Study of the United Kingdom, London, 1970. Johnson, Harry G., and Avellino R. Nobe, editors, The Current Inflation, London, 1971. Johnson, Harry G., The Monetary Approach to Balance of Payments Theory. Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, Volume 7, March 1972. pp. 1555-72. Kemp, Murray C., Errors of Measurement and Bias in Estimates of Impact. Demand Parameters, Economic Record, Volume 38, September 1962. pp. 369-72. Kennedy, Michael, An Economic Model of the World Oil Market, Bell Journal of Economics and Management Science, Volume 5, Autumn 1974, pp. 540-77. Kravis, Irving B., and Robert E. Lipsey, Price Competitiveness in World Trade. National Bureau of Economic Research, Columbia University Press, 1971. Kreinen, Mordecai E. Disaggregated Import Demand Functions, Further. Results. Southern Economic Journal, Volume 40, July 1973, pp. 19-25. Lerner, Edward E., and Robert M. Stern, Quantitative International Economics. Boston, 1970. National Institute of Economic and Social Research, The Effects of the Devaluation of 1967 on the Current Balance of Payments, Economic Journal, Volume 82. Supplement March 1972, pp. 442-64. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Economic Surveys. United Kingdom, 1968, Paris, November 1968. Economic Surveys. United Kingdom, 1969, Paris, December 1969. Parkin, Michael, and Michael T. Summer, editors, Incomes, Policy and Inflation. Manchester, England, 1972. Pierce, I. F. The Problem of the Balance of Payments, International Economic Review, Volume 2, January 1961, pp. 1-28. Phillips, P., A Forecasting Model for the United Kingdom Invisible Account. National Institute Economic Review, No. 69, August 1974, pp. 58-76. Richardson, J. David, The Response of Imports and Domestic Demand to Price, Tariff, and Exchange Rate Changes, A Structural Estimation Study for Selected U.S. Manufacturers, Mimeographed, University of Wisconsin, March 1972. Prepared under the auspices of the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Economic Affairs. Spitaler, Eric, Semi-Annual Wage Equations for the Manufacturing Sectors in 6 Major Industrial Countries, unpublished, International Monetary Fund. March 14, 1974. Taylor, Jim, Unemployment and Wage Inflation with Special Reference to Britain and the U.S. A. Harlow, England, 1974. Winters, L. A. Regressions for UK Export Volumes, Mimeographed, 1974.